Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just 1 minute. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Kyra Skunyon, and I am the immediate past president of the Harford County Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and a member of our Social Action Committee. On behalf of our Social Action co-chairs, Tanya Ferguson and Constance Buckley, and the entire Social Action Committee, just want to say thank you so much for making the time to join us this evening. We know that advocacy is so important, and we have one of the best facilitators, presenters here with us this evening to walk us through, Civic Education Advocacy 201. So before we get into that, just want to share a little bit about Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. It is a not-for-profit public service organization that was founded by 22 women down the street at Howard University in 1913. Today, the organization has more than 300,000 initiated members across 1,000 chapters, collegiate and alumni chapters in counties like Harford County and Cecil County across the globe, all across the globe. All of these chapters are tasked with local programming that focuses in 5 different areas: economic development, educational development, international awareness and involvement, physical and mental health, and political awareness and involvement. So this evening session falls under that political awareness and involvement thrust, and is one of the ways that we are helping folks not only be ready for the upcoming general election and understanding those timelines, but also understanding that as our new legislators are elected and put into their seats, how we can support different legislature that is put forward. Not just support, but fully understand that process. So without further ado, I want to introduce our chapter president to bring you words of greeting as well. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Carla Walton, president of the Harford County Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated.
Good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me all right. Can everyone hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep, you're good.
Awesome. We want to welcome you all to our virtual Advocacy 201. Last year, our chapter hosted 101, ensuring that our community was provided with pertinent information about the legislative session and engaging with legislators. We look forward to continuing tonight with Advocacy 201 session by bringing you more information on the voting timelines, ways to engage in council meetings, school board meetings, and the upcoming legislative session. I am particularly excited that we will hear from Kimberly Robinson, a longtime policy professional working at the state and federal levels. She is a member of the National Social Action Commission of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and one of my personal favorite sorors in the entire state. We were saying earlier when we were doing our practice, just to make sure we had all of our computers aligned, we were saying how busy Sora Robinson is, and we are just so grateful again that you still hold Harford County in that special place where you still take our phone calls, and you are so eager to help our community really make their way through anything politics. So thank you again, Kim, for taking time tonight. We know that there are so many other places you could be, so many things that you could be doing, and we're just so grateful that you are doing and spending this time with us. So thank you. Thanks again for joining us tonight. To all of you, we appreciate all of your time as well. We know that this is really critical. We have 2 weeks before we cast votes, and hopefully some will be casting votes early. But this is going to be a very, very informative session. on advocacy, and there is no better person to do that and to walk us through that than Kimberly Robinson. So sit back, take great notes, because this is going to be a very explosive session. Thank you again. We can't hear you, Kim. You're on mute, I think.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Yes, yep.
Okay, so good evening to my wonderful sorority sisters of the Hartford County Alumni Chapter, and to all of our guests. Thank you, President Walton, so much for your kind words and the opportunity to be before your chapter again tonight. Thank you to your social action chairs, Tanya Ferguson and Constance Buckley, for your hard work in the space of social action. And again, your constant support, not only of me personally, but of all the work that we do as a sorority. It is a pleasure to be with you again and to continue as you all work so hard to educate the Hartford County community and engage your community partners and community members in our legislative process and throughout civic engagement at every level in the county. I'm going to start with a PowerPoint. It's going to be brief, and it's going to sort of be the refresher from what we talked about when we got to do this last year, earlier this year, as sort of a 101. And then we're going to shift to our 201 conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Of course, we just did this. And of course, now my PowerPoint wants to hide. Give me 1 second.
That's always the way, isn't it?
It is always the way. And I think that shared my web
Yep,
page.
we can see it. Looks good.
But that was not my PowerPoint. Hold on 1 second.
Okay, well, we can see something.
You could, yeah, the share worked. But
While she's pulling that up, just a reminder that
There it
tonight's session will be recorded. So we will be providing that on our chapter's YouTube channel for reference after tonight's session as well. And if you have questions, feel free to jot them down and we'll make sure that they are relayed to our presenter, or you can put them right in the chat.
All right. Now, as they say, I think we're cooking with grease. All right. So again, we're going to start with sort of the more high level overview to set the stage before we move into the rest of the conversation, just because we want to make sure we're meeting everybody who has joined us this evening, wherever you are, when it comes to your experience with engaging, your knowledge of our legislative processes, all the things. So we're just going to start from the 101 perspective, and then we will move forward from there. All right. So we're going to briefly cover in this part of the workshop, why engage, government 101, the legislative process, and then when we get to communicating with legislators and effective advocacy, that's when we're going to take it up a level. So why engage at all in our civic and legislative affairs? It's one of those things that people who I think are passionate about it, who caught that bug, who once you understand, this is a no-brainer kind of question. But I think we all had the experience in our own lives of talking to family members or talking to neighbors, talking sometimes even to our own children about why one should engage, where they just don't seem to get it. It just doesn't click for them. And so trying to help others understand why this is important while we're making sure we understand it ourselves can sometimes be a challenge. And so whenever I talk to groups or family members or friends about really understanding why our voices are so important, it starts basically from the simple fact that government controls so much of what we experience in our lives, whether we're talking about in our town, our city, our county, our state, our nation. We have elected and appointed leaders who are making decisions about things that affect our lives every single day. And sometimes the things that get debated on the news are these very big international policies. And while certainly international policy can affect our lives in a big way, if another country shoots a missile at us, that's going to affect us. There are things that our politicians decide about every day that affect us in our everyday life. Whether or not your community has access to broadband goes back to a decision that some legislative body made about where one can put the cables that are required to be that fiber optic connection to that computer system that gives your community access to the internet. whether or
Carol
not,
Robinson, I'm sorry, don't mean to interrupt, but there's a box that says subtitles that's covering
Oh.
part of your slide. If you could put that
Oh.
in full.
I can, let's see. Oh, you know what? Because I'm looking, let's see. I am looking at one version of it and it is showing you a different version. Let's see. Let's pause for a second. I want to change your view
Okay.
because that's not the screen I want you to see. So we're gonna share it again. Let's share. How's that view?
Perfect. There we go.
Perfect. All right. So whether or not you've got clean water to drink in your neighborhood is affected by what some legislator someplace is deciding. How much money your schools are going to get, what's in your curriculum is going to be something that your school board is deciding. And I think sometimes when we look down to those everyday, very close to home, what we experience starting from when we wake up, and whether or not we have working electricity, whether or not our kids get picked up on a safe school bus, what is happening in their schools, whether or not our trash is being picked up, all of those experiences are going to be governed and are going to be impacted by who's in charge. And so if we aren't talking to who's in charge, if we're not telling them that our trash isn't getting picked up, if we're not telling them that we are not satisfied with the condition of our children's schools, if we're not telling them that we have questions about the safety of the water that we're drinking, why do they care? Why are they paying attention? And what are they going to do about it? It is incumbent upon all of us to raise our voices about the things that matter to us and make sure the people who've got a power over those things are using that power in a way that we support. That then allows us to hold those leaders accountable. So if I have reported to my county council member repeatedly that the Department of Public Works is not picking up my neighborhood's trash on time and it's affecting our quality of life when it brings out the critters and the deer and the trash starts to blow around the neighborhood and they're not being responsive to my calls to their office, I might not vote for them in another cycle. I want legislators, county council members, board members who are going to listen, who are going to take the community concern seriously and are going to do their best to engage both with me and my broader community and do something about it. It also is how we, again, influence and how they are going to shape our experiences as citizens as they make the policy that they're going to effectuate. So I'm gonna spend a little bit of this conversation using the state level as the example. So I'm just gonna lay the table for the state level, knowing that there is a similar dynamic that happens most specifically at Congress. Most state legislatures are built off of the same model as the US Congress. All of the states have bicameral, meaning 2-chamber legislators, except for one. We've got one state with a unicameral legislature, meaning it looks more like your county council where there's one legislative body. But in Maryland, we have two. We have a Senate and we have a House that make up the Maryland General Assembly. And so the Maryland General Assembly is comprised of both, again, that Senate of Maryland and the Maryland House of Delegates. And if you quick off the top of your head can name your state delegates and your state senator, I want you just to either drop their names in the chat or just drop into the chat that you know your elected leaders. If you don't, it's okay. This is your challenge from me to remind you to make sure that you know who they are. I especially want you to know who they are because we've got an election that's happening in 2 weeks. Early voting starts this week. And so it is incumbent again upon all of us to be engaging in that process because our first engagement with our electeds is deciding who they are. And we'll be deciding, as I state, who our electeds are for our governor, our comptroller, our attorney general, our House of Representative members at the federal level, and all of our members of the General Assembly in this election. Harford County will also be electing a new county executive because your current county executive is term limited and other local election seats. So there's absolutely a reason to know who your electeds are from the president all the way down to a county sheriff, your county council members, your school board members, every elected position at your county level. You want to make sure that you know who they all are. And if you don't, there are websites that will help you find that information quickly. So if you just Google who are my elected officials rather, there are lots of websites that will help you do that based on your address. So you'll know who is representing you. The Maryland General Assembly meets for 90 consecutive days as their legislative session. That's what we call the regular session. Occasionally, there are special sessions that the governor may call to address a specific important need that is time sensitive and cannot wait till the following January to be addressed. They don't happen all the time. We've had years where there've been more than one, but we also go many, many years with no special sessions. So their standing session is always going to start on that second Wednesday in January and conclude on the second Monday in April. That is dictated by the state constitution. To be even more specific, they start at noon on that Wednesday and end at midnight on that Monday night. And if you count them off on the calendar, it's exactly 90 calendar days. Do they meet every day during that 90 days? No, they don't tend to meet on weekends. They tend to probably meet about 2 Saturdays a year to make sure that they're getting all of their work done inside of their time frame. But in general, they meet Monday through Friday, do a lot of meetings on Mondays, committee hearings Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, a lot of committee voting on Fridays. And then again, they'll meet 1 or 2 Saturdays a year to make sure that they are, as they say, clearing the desk of all of the work before they get to that date of adjournment. And our House and our Senate have presiding officers, much like Congress. So we have the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House. And the question for this slide is, who is the President of our state Senate and who is the Speaker of the Maryland House of Delegates? So again, if you have the opportunity to drop the answers in the chat. Anybody who wants to throw out who the Senate President is and who the Speaker of the House is for the state of Maryland. I'm going to give it just a second before I give you the answers. Anyone? Well, our President of the Senate is Bill Ferguson. He hails from Baltimore City. And our Speaker of the House is Adrienne Jones. She hails from Baltimore County. Fun fact about Speaker Jones, she is the first African-American speaker and the first woman speaker that the state of Maryland has ever had. So she is a glass ceiling breaker in many, many ways. And she's been an excellent speaker to our General Assembly. So that's sort of laying the table as we talk about the legislature. And now we're going to turn our attention to really the more in-depth 201 level conversation. But I want to pause for a second and just see, are there any questions about anything I've said thus far? And I can't see if hands are raised, if anybody raises them in Zoom. So I'm going to ask tech to just let me know if you see any questions either in the chat or if anybody raises their hand. And if not, I'll keep going.
There are no questions in the chat, no hands raised at this time.
Thank you. All right, so the Maryland General Assembly legislative process. We're gonna switch screens for just a second so that I can share the visual for the legislative process. I probably should do it first. There we go. And are you still, let's see, tell me if you see this. Are you seeing the legislative process screen?
Yes.
Yes, we are.
Okay, great, thank you. I have 2 monitors, so I got to make sure it's showing you the right one. Thank you. All right, so the Maryland legislative process, again, very much mirrors the process that happens in Congress in terms of the way bills move between the 2 chambers. The things that are most important to know to help guide your advocacy is making sure you understand what the most important moments along the legislative spectrum are when it comes to how you best influence the legislative process. And the first step in influencing the process actually starts before we've got a bill. And that is building a relationship with your legislators. Your legislators are clearly just going to be 3 delegates and 1 senator who have the ability to introduce bills. They're going to be 1 of 47 senators and 3 of 141 delegates. But the first people that you're going to want to build a relationship are the people who specifically represent you in the legislature. So if you have never met your state senator, I would encourage you to make sure you do so. they are sometimes seen by voters. We feel like they're inaccessible, or they're, oh gosh, it's my state senator. They're all, generally speaking, really lovely people. They tend to be very open and responsive to their constituents. It's part of the job, and the good ones definitely make an effort to do so. They set time aside to do community meetings, or to meet with interested parties, to meet with specific individuals, to meet with community groups. And I think it's important that we all take time to get on their calendars, whether it's inviting them into your neighborhood association, whether it's having your organization, having the Harford County Alumni Chapter request a meeting with their senator, with their delegates. There is always the opportunity to start building that relationship. And when you do that, you, take the opportunity to let them know what are your priorities, what are the things that matter to you, what things you want to see them putting their energy behind, their weight behind, their own advocacy behind within the legislature. And it sets the table for what you are going to talk to them about if you want to hold them accountable for taking positions that deviate from the things that you believe in. But the first step is to let them know who you are, that you're their constituent, and building that connection so that they know that you're watching. I once was in a conversation with actually a group of young people who were complaining about, the administration, this is the federal level, the administration not prioritizing the things they care about, or their electeds don't do the things that they want them to do. And I just simply asked the question to the room, well, when did you tell them what you cared about? And they all looked at me and said, I'm sorry, what do you mean? I mean, when did you tell them what you cared about? How do they know what your personal priority is when you feel like they're not taking up the mantle and fighting for the thing you care about? When did you tell them what you cared about? And they were like, oh, I guess I didn't. Well, then how would they know? We sometimes make the assumption that because we're in a community, or we're talking to our friends, or we're part of organizations that care about something, that our electeds automatically will know what we prioritize. But it's like any relationship, nobody can read your mind. And so if I don't tell you what I want, how would you know what I want? So the first thing is to just start building that relationship and tell them what you care about. You can do that by email. You can do it by letter. You can do it in a meeting. You can do it in a community setting, but tell them what you care about. It's how you set the stage with creating priorities in your district with your legislators. That all happens long before there's legislation. In some ways, it can be more important than legislation because it's going to form what they're going to consider introducing as bills. And it's also going to help as they're deciding what their position is going to be on for bills, to understand what are the priorities of the people that they are supposed to be speaking for and the communities they represent. When we get into the legislative process, I think the important things to know about how to influence a bill once it's been introduced is, one, someone has to be paying attention to what is being introduced in the General Assembly. And I will, after this, I'll pull up the General Assembly website. I pulled it up, I think, the last time as well, but I'll pull it up again so everybody can see it. And I can just point out some key features for what you can use to help you see what bills have been introduced and what's out there to care about. But first, you need to know that the bill has been introduced. So someone in your organization, in the chapter, in the community, another organization that you follow who does bill tracking, you're going to want to know that House Bill 123 on something that's a topic I care about, school funding, has been introduced. And so once you see a bill, it's time to start talking about that bill. You're going to want to look at the bill. You're going to want to read what the bill says, or other summaries that either the legislature has prepared or other like-minded organizations have prepared, so you know what's in the legislation. And then you want to start thinking about, what do I think of this? Is this something that I like? Is this something that I dislike? Is this something that's okay but could be better, so that maybe it needs to be amended to make it a better bill or bring it closer to what I think it ought to say? You've got to figure out, what is my position on this issue, and what is my specific position about what the solution that's being proposed in the bill looks like. So here on your screen where it talks about the introducing of the bill, when you look at it in legislative terms, this is referred to as the first reading of the bill. A bill that's been introduced is being read for the first time. And that phrase is hearkening back to the very beginning of our legislative process in the United States. If you think about the way our Congress is physically set up, how our legislature is physically set up, even likely how people sit in your county council meetings. I know it's how we sit in the Baltimore City Hall in our city council meetings. There's often a presiding officer who is sitting behind the big desk where they are governing the meeting. And when we talk about a bill being read, back in the day, before we had computers, before we had typewriters, and they were handwriting legislation, when a proposal came forward, the legislative officer or the secretary for that legislative body literally read the bill to the room. And that's how everyone knew what the bill was about. So someone would pick that bill up and say, this bill has been introduced for this purpose, and the law will read as follows, and they would read it aloud. And so that was called the reading of a bill. And the first time that happened was when that bill was introduced, and we still use that language today. They no longer read the bill from start to finish in the legislature. They do it pro forma, and they will consider reading the title of the bill, the reading of the bill, because they know that you can access it on your computer and they expect you to read it for yourself. But you'll hear that term if you start to follow the legislative process, that this is a bill on first reading. So that's the bill that's being introduced anew. Bills are then assigned to committee, and the Maryland General Assembly has committees in the House and the Senate. They call them standing committees, which is where the majority of bills are assigned. There's a few special committees that get bills as well, but the large majority of bills go to the standing committees. And the House has 6, the Senate has 4 that do most of the policy work within those chambers. And knowing where the bill is going to be assigned, or where the bill has been assigned, will let you know who's going to handle it next. All of this information can be found when you track a bill on the General Assembly site. And so the committees then have the bill hearing, which is where testimony is taken. So testimony is another engagement point where individuals can choose to go and voice their opinion about the legislation. And testimony can be an art form unto itself. We talked a little bit about what testimony looked like in the previous presentation, and we can certainly touch on that if there's some interest. I'll leave space for that at the end. But testimony is another way in which we engage with our legislature and let them know what we think about bills. Testimony can be done in writing, testimony can be given orally, but that is certainly an important engagement point when it comes to what is going to happen with legislation. If the bill is considered favorably by the committee rather, it will be sent back to the floor to be read a second time. So you'll see here, it talks about the second reading of a bill. So a bill on second reader means that it was introduced at first reading, gone to a committee. The committee has taken some kind of favorable action. They've either passed it as they received it, making no changes, or they've made amendments to the bill. So they said, there's something good here, but we want to tweak it. And they've amended the bill. And that bill now comes back. And back in the olden days, what would happen is that bill, as it's come back from the committee, would have literally been read again to the body, hence the second reading. So bills that have now been voted out of committee are considered on second reader. And once they've been read for that second time, the bill sits for a day, and then that next day it can be considered by the full chamber for an official final vote, where the bill is considered now on third reading. So we're going to tell you what the bill says one more time, and now that chamber is going to vote on it. Influencing what the committee does through testimony, written or oral, is an important place along this process. Engaging with those members on the committee to make sure they know that you either support House Bill 123 or you oppose House Bill 123 is an important point, because that's the first place to kill a bill. is to have it not get a favorable vote out of the committee. The committee can say, no, we don't like this at all, and vote that bill down by a majority vote. And if that happens, then that bill does not make it to a second reading. It's just dead at that point and will not advance for that year. The floor vote can be a place where a bill can be killed. Floor votes are hard to kill bills on. It's not that it doesn't happen, but it's much more rare to see a bill that has made it all the way through the committee back to the floor of the chamber be voted down. But when advocacy groups feel really strongly about something, when they mount a grassroots campaign, when they get other voices to chime in and reach out to those legislators who are not on that committee, because again, only one committee really worked on this bill. The rest are relying on what that committee is sharing with them as they consider the bill and what they're hearing from their own constituents. It can happen that that bill goes down in that floor vote.
Kimberly, a question from the chat. How can we find out the agenda for legislative session in advance of the first reading of a bill?
Find out the agenda before the first reading of the bill. So there's no public place that you're going to just simply find that information. There are a couple of ways people like me who do this professionally do come to find these things out. So the first is, again, building relationships with legislators. Legislators talk to each other. Legislators are looking for co-sponsors on their legislation. They're often sometimes vetting their bills with interested parties because they want to get feedback before the bill is introduced. If there's a specific subject matter you're interested in, identifying who are the legislators who work in that space in particular. For example, I work in healthcare. Most of the legislation I care about goes to the Health and Government Operations Committee in the House. So if I'm curious as to what's going to come across the House's desk, I'm going to focus on my relationships with members of Health and Government Operations. I'm going to communicate with them. I'm going to ask them what their priorities are for that session. I'm going to ask them what are they hearing in terms of topics that are likely to be part of bills that are introduced. But I am leveraging building relationships with those legislators. A lot of really great advocacy organizations in our state who regularly engage with the legislature, finding ones that are focused on issues you care about, who are much more embedded in the legislative process is a great way because they will often be doing that on your behalf. They'll be having those conversations and doing that homework and learning what's coming through their conversations, and they go back and share it with their constituency, their membership, to say, oh, we're hearing there's going to be legislation about ABC topic coming in this year. We haven't seen a bill yet, but we're going to be on the lookout. Or someone shared a draft of a bill about XYZ topic. And so we're going to be giving feedback that we like or don't like what's being proposed. But it is not the easiest thing to figure out what's coming from a distance, because until the bill is introduced, the bill hasn't been introduced. And you've got to get someone who knows what they're planning to propose to share some information about that with you. That's a really good question. So much like Congress, we hear it all the time right now at the federal level. A bill came out of the House, but it didn't make it out of the Senate. All bills have to get through both chambers. So once the House has passed that bill, past third reading, affirmatively, the bill is transmitted to the Senate. In the old days, it was physically carried from point A to point B, and somebody walked that paper copy of the bill over to the Senate. And the Senate then repeats the entire process over again from first reading to committee to second reading to third reading passage. And if all goes well and no one has, specific concerns with the bill, that bill will make it all the way through that second chamber. And once it's past the second chamber, it's given back to its original chamber if it's a House bill, and then the House receives it and declares that it's passed because both chambers have voted the bill out. If the Senate gets a bill and decides, we kind of like this, but we still think we can do it better, we're going to make some changes, they too can amend a bill. And if the two chambers have passed bills that do not align, they go to what's called conference committee, what you see listed here, which is a select group of legislators are selected to sit down and hammer out the differences. If they can come to an agreement, then each chamber will affirmatively pass the agreed upon bill, and then that bill is able to become law. That's the quick and dirty of our legislative process, moving a bill all the way through. The question about where do you start when you're trying to engage in the process is a really good one. And I'm going to keep thinking about that one as we go forward in the conversation. So I'm going to shift my screen for what I'm sharing. And we are gonna take a look at the Maryland General Assembly's website. Do you see the General Assembly's website?
Yes, we do. Yep.
Okay, so Maryland has a very interactive website. If you've never seen it before, I'm just going to highlight some really specific features for the purposes of this conversation, but I encourage everyone to go out and visit the Maryland General Assembly's website and just spend some time fishing around, play around, see what resources are there. There's a lot to learn and a lot of information packed in this website at your fingertips. Starting here, we talked about if you're not sure who represents you at any level, Find My Representative starts right here. If you want to look up information on senators or House members, you can look them up here. When I talked about the committees, you can find the list of the Senate and House committees, the other committees, and then other things that the committees put together under the committee tab. Meetings when we're in session, and even now during the interim, there are legislative work groups that are meeting on any given day. And so you can come here to the meetings tab and you can keep up with what meetings are happening. Today, of course, was a slow day because I clicked on today, but and it's probably slow right now because we're coming up on the election and everybody is up for election in the House and the Senate. But normally, even during the interim, you might find that a work group in the Senate or a work group in the House is meeting. And during the legislative session, here's where it will show you all of the bills that are up for hearing on any given day. They post them in advance so you can look forward and see what bills are coming. If you wanted to just look at the calendar. This is the tab, though, that I think is generally most interesting, the legislation tab. So one, this first screen is just giving you statistics about what passed and what didn't pass and what was introduced in each of the chambers. But here is where you can look up bills, and it's going to have a chronological list of all the bills. Lots of great hyperlinked information exists here. But if you know your bill number, you can just type in the bill number that you're looking for, and it will filter you down to exactly the bill that you're looking for. It will also filter you, and you'll see here it pulled the Senate 120 because I didn't put House or Senate, and then it also pulled the House 120, both for my search results. You can search for legislator name by sponsor, you can put in keywords, you can put in committees, and it will filter however you choose to search in this particular box. Which is a great way to find legislation when you maybe don't know the bill number or you're looking for things on certain topics. When you click into a bill, this part at the top, which I think I showed in the previous workshop, is really, really useful in letting you know where a bill is. And the reason why I took the time to talk about what a first, second, and third reading was, is because here's where you're going to see those terms. And if you don't know what they mean, this isn't as helpful as it could be. But because we know first reading means introduced, the first thing you'll see, if nothing else has happened with this bill, is you'll have a single check mark at first reading. You'll see that it's been referred to committee. That means that the committee is now ready to hear testimony on the bill. You'll see second reading if it came out of committee and is sent to the floor. You'll see third reading where the floor is acted, and if it passes, you'll see that it moves then to that opposite chamber. So this gives you a great chronology of where the bill is all the way through making it to the governor's office to be signed. Below, you'll find links where you can pull up the hearing on the bill. So right here, this little camera, you could actually watch the bill hearing. It's archived, so you can go back and watch a bill hearing. They're streamed live. Any day bill hearings are going on. The floor sessions are streamed live, and the committee hearings are all streamed live every day that they're occurring. It'll tell you if the bill is cross-filed with a bill in the other chamber. So lots of good information packed in here as well for any bill. I heard a,
One question related
Yeah.
to what you were just speaking of. So the question is, what level of access does a constituent have to committees in order to understand background points of view, legislators who may be sponsoring or those who may be involved in drafting bills?
Ooh, okay. So, what level of access? So let's just start with the committees in general. Their work is public. So again, you can watch the committee hearings, you can watch the committee voting sessions, all live streamed on the internet on the days that they're meeting. So that's a great public access just to them as they're doing their work and seeing what it is. Again, electeds are public officials. They choose to make themselves available to the public and to their constituents. Session is a busy time. It's not the easiest time to start trying to meet with folks, and their calendars will get busy as their days get longer because they're in longer floor sessions and longer hearings, but they still do typically reserve time to meet with interested parties, to meet with constituents, and to get that kind of feedback one-on-one or one-to-group from organizations who want to share that kind of information. Understanding who is asking for a bill to be drafted, that takes a little bit more paying attention. Often when you get to the bill hearing, you'll have transparency as to who is behind the bill, because they're often going to show up as a proponent witness. So if I am the one who asked Delegate Buckley to put a bill in, I'm likely going to go with her to the table, and she's going to introduce the bill, and then I'm going to speak to the bill as a proponent of the bill. Typically, those lead proponents are going to be the advocates, or those who are advocating for that particular piece of legislation. Sometimes the legislator comes up with the bill all on their own, and there's not a specific proponent who asks for the bill, but often it's going to be a constituent, it's going to be an advocacy group, it's going to be an interested party, it's going to be a business community that's asked for the legislation. Sometimes, if you're familiar with the issue and looking at what the bill is trying to accomplish, you can kind of glean, just by understanding the issue, who is likely in support of the bill, and therefore likely the proponents who requested the bill, but not always. Sometimes you've got to pay attention to who's providing testimony and who is engaging around the bill to kind of get a sense of where that bill has come from. Did I answer all the pieces of that question, Sora? There was a couple of different things that were being asked.
I believe so. So the level of access that a constituent has to committees.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, you did. You answered all of that.
And now that we're getting a little bit more endemic than pandemic with COVID, my understanding is they are likely to return to in-person committee meetings where witnesses can be in the room. I do understand that the legislature is trying to explore how to do hybrid testimony, where they will have in-person witnesses but still keep some level of virtual testimony as an option for constituents. They're working that out from a tech perspective. So I have not seen a final decision on how they're going to execute a hybrid model, but I know that that's their desire. Otherwise, hearings will still be streamed online. Whether or not you can testify virtually is a separate question. And then there will be public access back being inside of the committee room. All right, so we're gonna shift. So this is a high level overview of what is on the General Assembly. You'll see there's a whole tab just for budget. If you are concerned about funding, if you're looking for where we're putting our money as a state, you want to see where those resources go, the information in this tab is outstanding in understanding our budgeting process, seeing where our budget is, looking at what the state considers to be its spending affordability, how much money we realistically can spend in any given year as a state to stay flush with cash. All of this information is going to be found along this particular tab. Existing law can be found here. You can look up statutes, you can look up county ordinances and governing ordinances for municipalities. Here you'll find information on a day-to-day basis about what's happening on the floor of the House of the Senate. There's an index that shows all of the proceedings, so you can see the day and the proceeding number. And if you click into that, you can see which bills moved across the floor on any given day. And you can actually watch the floor proceedings as you see the Senate president calling them to order. You can go back and watch those floor proceedings there as well. And of course, that opened me in another window. So back to the Senate index. And then there's lots of search functions. You can search for all kinds of ways for information. So this is the basic Maryland General Assembly site. So I wanted to make sure to just show people that again, as we move into that time of year on the other side of January. So, but where we are right now is election season. And so what we know we've got coming first in how we engage with our elected officials is going to be voting in this election. There's been a lot that's gone on as we've moved towards this election season. And there is a lot that I want to just quickly touch on to make sure, because I did hear the members of the Social Action Committee emphasizing voting as we were coming on to tonight's webinar. This is the website for the Maryland Board of Elections. Can you see the Board of Elections site?
Yes, we can.
Yep.
Awesome. So if you've never been on it, I encourage everybody to also get familiar with the Board of Elections site. Very easy, elections.maryland.gov. Here is all of the official information for the elections in the state of Maryland. As you can see right here with this particular tile, reminding people that early voting is about to begin. So early voting kicks off this week. We've got about 10 days, or maybe I think we're 8 days in Maryland of early voting. So including weekends, you can vote at any early voting site in your county where you live. So it doesn't have to be even the one in your neighborhood. If you're running errands on Saturday and you're closer to a different site that day, you can early vote at any early voting site in your county. They'll be able to give you the appropriate ballot for your district, regardless of which site you go to. We have no excuse needed mail-in voting. There is a deadline to request a mail-in ballot that I think is next Tuesday, the 1st of November. That's closing in. If you haven't already requested one, you can mail that back as long as it is postmarked by Election Day. You can drop that in a drop box as another way to get that ballot back. And of course, you can go in person to your assigned polling place on Election Day. So that's the difference between the early voting and Election Day. Any early voting site in your county, in early voting, your specific assigned polling place for your district on Election Day. I know that the members of Harford County alumni are making sure that their family, their friends, all of their community partners are making sure that their constituencies and members are prepared to get out to vote on Election Day. We have ballot initiatives in the state that are going to be on your ballots. They're often local initiatives that are going to be on the ballot for this particular election. I will flag that from a statewide perspective, probably the most hotly debated initiative on this year's ballot from a statewide perspective has to do with the legalization of cannabis. Maryland allows medical cannabis in the state. The legislature has debated for years joining the other jurisdictions that have fully legalized marijuana in their states. Maryland has decriminalized marijuana, but not legalized marijuana in the state of Maryland. And so they've opted instead to put it to the voters. So that is one of the ballot questions. I think it's question H on the ballot for this year. Making sure that people know their proper polling place is going to be important, and making sure as best you can that people are paying attention to all of the races, because we're electing a new governor in this particular cycle. We are electing every member of the General Assembly in this particular cycle. You're electing a new county executive in Harford County in this particular cycle. So there's lots of really important elections and questions that are going to be on this ballot. And we'll have a lot of change come November 8th, or at least a few days after, once all of the mail-in votes are also counted. So I did want to take a moment, because we did talk about the importance of voting briefly at the start, to highlight the elections website. Again, it's a great website packed with information and guidance, lots of FAQs and things to know about what to anticipate in the election. And I would also encourage all the partner organizations, as well as our sponsoring host tonight, the Harford County Alumni Chapter, to also circulate election protection information. While Maryland is a different flavor than some of the other states in the country in terms of the things we see on voter suppression, we're not at the top of the list for the most aggressive voter suppression tactics. There's still always things that go wrong in any election, whether they are intentional voter suppression tactics or just a failure of someone to do their job properly. Things like the polling place not opening on time, or the voting machines not working properly, having the wrong ballots for that particular district. These are just administrative things that sometimes go wrong in an election, but there are voter protection resources and phone numbers that you ought to consider circulating on your social media and to your constituency, to make sure people know what to do if they encounter a problem at the polls. I often volunteer with the Election Protection Committee, that's a partnership between the NAACP and the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, as an attorney, to help answer those questions on election day and help get people to help when something is going wrong where they are. Prayerfully, we will not be like we're seeing in Arizona, where you've seen pictures of armed men intimidating voters who just simply want to return an early vote ballot to a ballot box. That's not been our MO as a state, and hopefully it won't be in this election either. But it's always important to know what the resources are when somebody has trouble voting. Was there another question? I feel like I saw a question pop up. Or maybe it was just a comment in the chat.
Right, no additional questions yet.
Okay, thank you. All right, so circling back to round out effective advocacy, this is, I'm gonna go back to the slides. Make sure I pick the right screen. Let's see, I think this is the right one. Let's see. We're gonna go to the screen. So the goals of good advocacy at the end of the day is to make change. And the question we're asking is, what are you going to do about it? Whether I'm asking you as a constituent, how are you going to engage? Or we're asking the decision maker, what are they going to do about addressing the problem we've identified? These are what I consider to be the four most important things to have top of mind as you are preparing to engage, whether it's just generally in a policy conversation with your elected, or if you are engaging and advocating around a specific piece of legislation. And the first is to identify, in this case, this was taken from a Delta context, the national priority, but in this case, it really could just be whatever priority, whatever the policy is, whatever that topic is that you think is important and requires your engagement, identifying exactly what that is. So clean water, this will be a little bit more federally focused because the feds have much more EPA sort of influence, but there's also a local environmental impact that happens through our Department of Environment. So, you know, if that's our issue and we're focused on what are we doing to protect the water table, what are we doing to protect the water systems, how are we ensuring that we don't have another E. coli outbreak like Baltimore City had at Labor Day, or that we don't become Jackson, Mississippi, or we don't become Flint, Michigan. What are we doing to protect the water in our state? If that's our issue, and that's what we want to do, the next thing we need to do is research. We need to make sure we're educated. We want to make sure that we are speaking facts, that we understand the topic, that we have done our homework, and that we are speaking from a place of knowledge when we want to then be able to have these conversations with decision makers, right? So first we got to identify our issue, then we need to learn about our issue. We need to research that issue, and we need to let that help us shape what we want to advocate around in making change to protect the water table, to protect our natural resources, to ensure that we are investing in our infrastructure for water, that we are remedying lead pipes, whatever that thing we want to focus on might be, we want to make sure we've done our homework. We don't want to go advocating to eradicate lead pipes in the one town that it's actually already gotten rid of them, right? We want to make sure that we know what we are asking makes sense for where we're asking for it to happen. And we want to educate others. In this case, it says your chapter and community. That still fits. If you are the Social Action Committee of Hartford County Alumni, you want to educate your chapter members and then go out and educate your community partners. If you're one of our community partners who's on the call, you want to start with your supporters and again, expand that to the community so that we are not just targeting policymakers, but we want everybody to understand why this is important. It's also how we get support for our point of view. And then we want to advocate for that policy change, for that legislative change, and finding things that are going to help us move the ball on this issue. Sometimes that's going to be legislative. Sometimes that is going to require a bill. Sometimes it's not going to require a policy bill. Sometimes what it needs is more funding. There needs to be more money that your county is allotting to the Department of Public Works for repairs. Sometimes it's we need the state to be giving more money to the Department of the Environment or the federal government to better funding the EPA. Sometimes it means we need to be having the state enter into agreements with other entities to do things like clean up the Chesapeake Bay, or making sure that we're limiting, pollution, or managing how Conowingo Dam is being handled and what impact it's having on the environment. There can be lots of different solutions that come along with that. And so as we learn about it, we also learn all the different ways we might need to attack the problem. And then we tailor our talking points to our audience. One thing for legislators, one thing for regulators. We can also advocate with the Department of Human Resources or the Department of Health here in the state of Maryland. You can advocate with your county executive's office the same way you can advocate with your county council. You can advocate with your local Department of Public Works to make sure that they understand what's a priority. Everything isn't always legislative, but the idea of identifying a problem, researching your problem, educating yourself and others about it, and then advocating about it, that applies no matter who you're talking to. Your solution just might look different depending on who that audience might be. I'm going to pause here and give folks an opportunity to really ask me your advocacy questions. I know we call this a 201, but really understanding what is the next level of questions or things or thoughts that people may have will make it a little bit easier to figure out what else it is you might want or need to know.
We do have a few questions for you.
So I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I would love to answer the questions.
Yeah, no, we appreciate that. So a few more questions. So has national headquarters identified key community partners on the national level with whom we can build alliances at the state level?
That's a great question. So shout out to whatever member of Delta Sigma Theta asked that question. That's a Delta specific question, but I will share that we do have a number of national partners in different corners of the policy world. I will work with Soares, Buckley, and Ferguson to share some of those partners. Some would not surprise you. Places like the NAACP, the Urban League, are certain long-standing partners. We work with the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation. We work with NCNW. We work with the March of Dimes on the health side. We work with Planned Parenthood on the health side. We work with the American Cancer Society. There's a number of partners in different areas. And if you happen to have a specific topic you're interested in and want to know if we have a partner there, let your social action chairs know, and I can work with them to help get you information.
Do you anticipate that congressional redistricting in Maryland will have a major impact on the upcoming elections? Is there one county or jurisdiction of a particular concern? And what's the best strategy to safeguard our county against gerrymandering?
That's an excellent question. Gerrymandering is certainly going to reshape the House of Representatives. If you watch any of our national media, you'll see a lot of conjecture suggesting that party control will flip in the House of Representatives in this election, because all 435 members are up for election. And because they serve in districts, they are subject to gerrymandering in their respective states. Maryland is known as a heavily gerrymandered state. Maryland sits on the same list as North Carolina. We're just gerrymandered by different parties. And so I think people's perspectives on it all depends on what your personal political leanings are. Delta is agnostic from political perspective. We are a nonpartisan organization. What we focus on in gerrymandering is whether or not a district is respecting communities of color and keeping communities of interest coherent within that district. We are always fighting against efforts to, as they call it, crack Black communities, which is take a Black community that's got enough voting strength to elect someone who represents them to their satisfaction and break it up to dilute their political power, or pack Black communities, which is to say, take Black communities and say, well, they've got too much power if we put them in these two districts that might let them elect two people they might like better. We're going to pack them all into one space so we can at least contain their political power. And so that's the things we focused on when it came to redistricting. In Maryland, and this is not a Delta perspective, I'm just going to give you the political landscape of our congressional districts. Maryland has 8 congressional districts that we still maintained after the census in the House of Representatives. 2 cycles ago in the census, Maryland had 3 Republicans and 5 Democrats. Redistricting drove that number down at one point to 2 Republicans and 6 Democrats. Redistricting again drove that number down to 7 Democrats and 1 Republican. And so right now, the way our districts are drawn, that political balance is likely to be maintained. There's a big fight happening in District 1, which is where Republican Andy Harris sits, and Heather Mazur is a Democrat who was challenging him there. There was efforts arguably made to try to make that district less Republican friendly. That's part of gerrymandering that some believe happened in our state. There was litigation about it, and the courts did come in and intercede around both our Maryland House of Delegate districts, as well as our congressional House districts. So only time will tell what the impact of that is or isn't, or what that balance of power comes out to be after this election.
There are 10 questions on the ballot. How is it determined what questions are placed on the ballot?
That's a great question. Questions get on the ballot generally one of 2 ways. One is they are placed by the legislature, which still required passing a bill to say we are passing a bill to place a referendum on the ballot, i.e. the ballot initiative around the legalization of marijuana that came from legislation where the General Assembly opted to put the question to voters. Another way, and at the local level, similar things happen. Your county council can place ballot initiatives on the bill in a similar fashion. I mean, on the ballot in a similar fashion to meet the county's needs when things either require that it be done through initiative. Often county spending happens that way, where the citizens authorize a bond or other things financially in your locality. And there's likely a legislative process that happens through. Or they can be done by petition. So sometimes ballot initiatives get on the ballot because interested parties successfully do a petition drive to get a question on the ballot, and your Board of Elections will have information on its website about what it takes to get a ballot initiative on the ballot. It usually has a threshold number of signatures that have to be collected and then verified as legitimate to get a question placed on a ballot at the state or the local level.
Can you explain the difference between advocacy and lobbying?
Sure. Advocacy and lobbying. So I'm going to start with lobbying. Lobbying is a term that has both a colloquial meaning. We all lobby someone in our lives. My niece, from very, very small, I told her mom she was an excellent lobbyist as I listened to her state her case for why her mom should let her have a second hot dog at the cookout. That little girl lobbied her behind off. She made it very hard to tell her no. It is fundamentally simply the act of trying to convince or persuade someone to do what you want. And in that same way, so can advocating be. But when we talk about the legislative or political realm, lobbying is a legal term of art. In Maryland, there's a statutory definition of lobbying. If you meet the definition of a lobbyist, like me, you have to be registered with the state of Maryland. I have to be approved by the state as qualified under the requirements of the law to be able to lobby. I have to have a, clean criminal background record and all kinds of things that make it so that I can be a lobbyist in the state. I have to pay a fee, and I have to re-up my registration annually. It doesn't just, you don't just do it once. So we ask and advise folks not to refer to themselves as lobbyists if you aren't a registered lobbyist, because people will interpret it as meaning something different than what you mean. So that's one aspect of why I distinguish between advocacy and lobbying, and certainly part for those who are members of Delta Sigma Theta, why we do so inside the sorority, because also at the federal level, federal lobbyists are registered. Most states require lobbyists to register. I've been registered in Maryland and Virginia. It goes with the territory. Also, because of that, IRS rules differentiate advocating and lobbying. Lobbying is considered generally direct action on a piece of legislation. And so we ask chapters to be thoughtful about how many pieces of legislation you're targeting in any given year, making sure they're aligning with the national priorities, and controlling that, because there is, for any nonprofit like we are, even being a C7 and not a charitable nonprofit like a 501c3, where there's a threshold for how much of your activity can be lobbying. Advocacy is focused on the policy, the bills are secondary. So it's not just a singular focus on House Bill 123. It is unwavering support for clean water. I know I keep going back to water today, but it's unwavering support for clean water, which House Bill 123 happens to be about. So when we talk to legislators, we don't need a bill to say what our position is. Our position is we want lead-free water, we want safe water, we want protection of our waterways, we want access to water to be guaranteed to all citizens, regardless of neighborhood or ethnicity or income. There's a policy that you can advocate around when it comes to that. And then there happen to be bills that align with that. So if I say to a legislator, look, here's what I care about, you happen to have a bill that's on that, and I want you to act on that bill in alignment with my policy. While it sounds subtle, there is a distinction than being a person whose job it is, or an organization who is specifically targeting pieces of legislation sort of one by one as what you're doing, and not part of that larger true advocacy effort. Within the sorority, I promise you there's a whole workshop just on this. And I encourage you to join us at Delta Days in the Nation's Capital, where we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth, because it is in some ways a subtle difference, but it's still a meaningful one. And when we have a lot of bills that we think that members ought to engage on, one of the ways we deal with this, and I think one of the ways many advocacy organizations and other nonprofits deal with this, is to say, we don't always have to go screaming it in our name. It doesn't have to be that the letter came from Harford County Alumni Chapter. It just can be that Harford County Alumni Chapter alerted its members that House Bill 123 aligns with our policy. And I want you, Tanya Ferguson, and I want you, Carla Walton, and I want you, Constance Buckley, to, as a citizen, write your own letter or make your own phone call or send your own email as an individual and raise your voice in saying oppose House Bill 123 or support House Bill 123. That, as an individual, you're not going to become a lobbyist. You're not being paid to do it. You're speaking as a citizen in your own opinion. That's going to be outside of that space. And that's okay. And frankly, it's the more effective way to do it, only because one letter from the chapter is one letter. But one letter from every member of the chapter is much more impactful. One letter from every member of their chapter plus their spouse and children is more impactful. One letter from every member of their chapter, their spouse, their child, and their neighbor is more impactful in showing the number of voices that are concerned about it. And so there is a need to sometimes shift our mindset from thinking only about Delta or another organization as that organization has to say something on the bill, and that instead it's for that organization to educate the community and get all of the community members saying something, because that's really how you let the community voice be heard.
Great response. And one question, share any quick tips with voters as we get ready to vote on November 8th?
Yes, that's a great question. So the first tip is make a plan. Decide how you're going to vote. Are you going to do early voting one day this week or into the beginning of next week? If so, have you identified what day you think you're going to vote and which polling place you think you're going to go to, so that you have double checked that early voting center that you went to 4 years ago or 2 years ago is actually still your early voting center. And once you sort of know when and where you're going to go, you have a plan in place. If you're not going to early vote, if you're going to request a ballot, making sure that you've kept your eye on what that deadline to make your request is if you haven't done it already. Paying attention to making sure you got your ballot in the mail. And making sure that you've made a note of when you've got to have it postmarked and how you're going to send it back to make sure that your ballot is going to count. On the election website, if you do mail-in voting, you can actually track your ballot. So it will tell you when your ballot was received, and if your ballot, well, when your ballot was received, when your ballot was screened, and if your ballot was counted. So all of that information is available on the website. And then if you're going to vote on the day of the election, making sure you know what your in-person polling place happens to be. Again, they change over time. Where you voted last might not be where you vote this time. So you're going to want to make sure you've double checked and know where your polling place is. Best source is, again, that Maryland Elections website. Put in your address and it'll tell you your poll. And again, paying attention to the fact that the polls are open from, I believe, 7 a.m. until 8 p.m., planning when you're going to go, making sure you've given yourself ample time so you don't have to worry about running out of time, trying to rush and do it on a short lunch break or when you don't have much time, making sure you give yourself the time you need to be present and get your vote counted. If you get to a polling place and for some reason they're saying they don't see you on the books, or they're saying you're in a different district, don't be afraid to vote that provisional ballot. Provisional ballots still count. They were designed to make sure they don't just turn you away and you don't get to vote. At least if you vote the provisional ballot, you have a vote on record that once they get through the initial vote count, they will go back and double check and screen those provisional ballots for validity. Make sure you are who you say you are. I mean, they'll have that information, and making sure that you are in the district that they've told you you are in, so they apply it properly. And then you can also see if your provisional ballot has been counted on the Maryland Elections website. So that's another check that you can go back and check. And then I would also say making sure you have the voter election protection hotline in your phone. So if something does jump off or something does go awry, you know who to reach out to for help. Basically create your plan, follow your plan, work your plan to make sure that you have given yourself the time and the space to get your vote counted this election season. Oh, and lastly, but also very important, there are sample ballots available on the elections website. You probably also received one in the mail from your election bureau in your county, but if you haven't, or you don't know where it is, or it's lost in the junk mail, like I know mine is, you can go on their website and look at a sample ballot so that you can, again, see who's running in all those races. Take a moment and go pull up their websites and see what they say they're about, or Google them and see what others are saying. If you're a person who, you know, is interested to see who any given newspaper endorsed in the area, you can take the time to go look those up and read about the candidates. If there's an office that's up for election that you just don't feel familiar with, for instance, we've got a comptroller's race happening right now in the state of Maryland. And a lot of people have said to me, because it's gotten more attention than the average comptroller's race, because it's an open seat for the first time in many years, they're like, I don't really know what a comptroller does. It's your chance to get familiar now with who that office is, so you can look at those candidates and answer the question of, who looks like the better candidate to you. So we're at a great time, being 2 weeks out, to do your homework, to understand the candidates, the office. Well, let's start this way: the offices, the candidates, and the ballot questions, and then make your plan to vote so you know how you're going to get that done. I'm really passionate about voting. That was a really long answer to your very short question, but I hope that was helpful.
Very helpful hints, though. We definitely appreciate it. Kimberly Robinson, SOAR Kimberly Robinson, cannot thank you enough for your time and your passion, your energy, and just all of the information that you shared with all of us this evening. Please take a look in the chat, because you'll see kudos and accolades for how informative your session has been this evening. Want to remind everyone that there is a survey. The link has been dropped into the chat. This will also be emailed to you, but there is a link that's been dropped into the chat. We'll take just a minute or so for you to complete the survey about this evening's session. Also want to share a few reminders. I'm the president of the Hartford County League of Women Voters as well. There is a guide that we've put together that gives you all candidates for Hartford County and how they have replied to different questions on a number of different topics: law enforcement, criminal justice, education, redistricting. All of those questions were asked, and their responses directly as they shared them are included in that Vote 411 guide. So that link has been dropped into the chat as well. You all have joined us this evening to show that you are clearly interested in advocacy and learning more about that. The Hartford County League of Women Voters is hosting a Board of Education Candidates Forum next Tuesday, November 1st, on Zoom at 6:30 p.m. I will make sure to get our social action co-chairs the flyer so that everyone who's attended the session this evening will have that information. But we hope that you can join us, because this is your opportunity to hear from and to ask your questions directly to our Board of Education candidates. Okay, thank you so much again for taking the time. Please make sure that you utilize the links and the information that have been shared in the chat. We'll also make sure that those are included in the follow-up email as well. And SOAR Kimberly Robinson, thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll have this session. The session has been recorded, and we'll make sure that we share this on our chapter's YouTube page as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.